I think I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I am Lori Lefkowitz. I direct the Northeastern University Humanities Center. And as many of you know, this Faculty Works in Progress series is a collaborative effort of between the Humanities Center and the Dean's Office in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. It is a wonderful opportunity, as those of you who attend this often know, for us to hear the work of our colleagues in progress. And a certain number of these occasions are devoted to the ongoing projects of our Humanities Center Fellows, who this, and I see a number of you here among us, thank you for being here. This year we have a really extraordinary group. Our theme is disruptions and displacements and disruptions, one or the other of those. But we have been looking at disruption and displacement from numbers of disciplinary points of view. Today is the last of those of the presentations of the Fellows of the Humanities Center for this year. So those of you who have been here before will see rounded out the full complement of what we have been working on together as a collaboration. And you'll also see that in the case of today's presenters, we have a synergy in their research interest or in climate-related research, though in adjacent fields. This is the ultimate of those presentations, but the penultimate faculty work in progress. And I just want to invite you all to put on your calendars that the final faculty work in progress will be Monday, April 5th, in 2 weeks, from 12 to 1 again. And then you will have an opportunity to hear from two historians who are working collaboratively, Gretchen Hefner and Philip Ty, presenting on disease, diplomacy, and science in the Cold War, lessons for future pandemics. And I would encourage you to attend that and help us publicize it, because this will be an opportunity for us to showcase a much larger project, and that is the pandemic teaching initiative that emerged out of a number of collaborations in the college. So without further ado, let me introduce today's presenters, our faculty fellows. The first is Daniel Faber. Professor Danny Faber is a professor of sociology. He's the director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative and affiliated faculty in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Professor Faber's project is Climate Justice and Migration, the global climate refugee crisis. His research is focused in the areas of political economy and crisis theory, environmental sociology and policy, social movements, classical and contemporary social justice theory, environmental justice, philanthropy, Central America and underdevelopment, and globalization. And he's the co-founding senior editor of the international journal Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, the co-editor of numbers of books, and author of a number of research studies. He's currently working on a book on the ecological contradictions of American capitalism towards a more transformative environmental policy. Danny will speak for about 15 minutes or so, followed by Laura Kuhl, and I will introduce her as well so that we can just move from one presentation to the next. Laura Kuhl is assistant professor of public policy and urban affairs, and she's also affiliated with international affairs. Her project is called Delivering Transformation in Practice, Competing Priorities Across Scale in Adaptation Finance. And having heard her presentation to the group, I now understand what that means. You'll find that it's actually quite fascinating. Professor Kuhl's research examines climate adaptation and resilience in developing countries. Prior to Northeastern, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She has studied innovation technology transfer, and adoption for adaptation, as well as mainstreaming adaptation in development policy in East Africa and Central America. Professor Kuhl has conducted fieldwork in Latin America, the Caribbean, and East Africa, and has collaborated with the Global Environment Facility, United States Agency for International Development, and United Nations Development Program. These are all mouthfuls. So it's very exciting and very important research, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Daniel Faber.
Thank you very much, Lori. It's great to be here. And I just want to take this moment to extend my appreciation to all the colleagues I was working with at the Humanities Center this year. It's been an incredible experience, just being able to exchange our works in progress and give ideas back and forth. I've learned so much. It's been such a wonderful experience, and I really appreciate all the effort that Lori's put into making this happen. It's really been remarkable. I'm going to share my screen here and talk about what I see as the, let me bring this up real quick. I want to talk about what I see as the global climate refugee crisis. And we've now entered an era of crisis where we have the intersection of both economic and ecological crises on a global scale, magnified by the pandemic, but also by global climate change. And I think this is really the first time in my life where I can really see and feel climate change. And we just came off 2020, which was the hottest year on record. And we now know from some of the latest science that climate change is accelerating much quicker than was first anticipated. And has in fact reached a point now where it's beginning to feed upon itself through a number of different biofeedback mechanisms. It's actually beginning to unleash natural processes which are magnifying the process. So much of my research is doing a popular report on climate refugees for the new Global Center on Climate Justice, which we're launching this spring. I'll be a senior fellow to help popularize this research and some of the implications around the climate refugee crisis for a larger audience. And for many scholars, the climate refugee crisis is one of the most important manifestations of climate change. It's one of the ways we can see the severity of climate change. So I'm going to introduce some concepts and go fast, but one is this notion of vulnerability, which is a really important concept in the sense that not all people are vulnerable to climate-related stresses in the same manner. And that has everything to do with one's political economic capacity to cope and adapt to climate change. And so these notions of class and race and gender and neo-colonial status are really fundamental. How much power you have as an individual or a community to adapt with climate change is really fundamental to understanding who bears the greatest cost and burdens associated with climate change. And so much of the literature on climate refugees, I'll make a couple of statements right off the bat, tends to naturalize the problem of climate refugees. That is, it sees it solely as an outcome of climate-induced stresses. This is known as the maximalist position. And very often what it does in such accounts is that the larger social, political, and economic structures in which people live their lives, in which people are embedded, are often rendered invisible in sort of these naturalistic accounts. And so to me, this is deeply problematic because in one culture, you can experience a climate-related stress and it can result in tremendous dislocations. And in a neighboring country, it can result in very minimal social dislocations. And that can be because not that the environmental factors are that significantly different, but rather the political economic structures render people much more vulnerable to those stresses in one culture than they do the other. So part of my research is to render these unjust social and economic systems visible and look at what role they play in the climate refugee crisis. Very quickly, I want to introduce three different notions of what we consider to be climate-related injustices. One, there are socioeconomic injustices that are often displaced onto communities with less political economic power within nations. So we look at New Orleans, for example, with the lack of investments in the levees around the lower Ninth Ward and so forth. When Hurricane Katrina hit, it was those sections of working class neighborhoods and communities of color that resulted in the greatest displacement. 175,000 people of color were displaced by Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Only 75,000 of them ever came back. We can also look at international injustices, particularly between North and South, the way in which climate change is fostering the displacement of some of the greatest impacts on nations that had those a very, very insignificant role in fomenting climate change, such as the Pacific Island nations. And then intergenerational injustice, the way in which climate change is increasingly going to foster greater and greater impacts on future generations, many of which have yet to be born. So one of the things I would try to emphasize in the talk is that climate change is happening now, and that its impacts are accelerating, but also they're really quite significant. So whether you're looking at the 2003 heat wave in Europe, which killed over 71,000 people during that heat wave, that we can see that these impacts, global impacts, are increasing. And so some of the latest numbers show that about 68 million people were displaced by what we call major natural weather events in 2017. And even right now, we see such an event occurring in Australia. I mean, we've seen the news, but projections are that by the time these rains in New South Wales and Southern Australia, they're going to see around 40 inches of rain. Scientists are saying this is a 1 in 100 to perhaps a 1 in 1,000 event right now in terms of the rainfall that they're now receiving in South Australia. So these types of extreme weather events are becoming increasingly common, and the rate of natural disasters are going up in response to climate change. And so in 2019, we saw about 25 million people displaced across 140 countries by the increased frequency of these major events. The British government, through the Stern Commission, officially estimates that by the year 2050, 200 million people could be displaced by climate change. This study is quite old and considered quite conservative now in many different circles. It's estimated to have perhaps a depressionary impact on the world economy, destroying perhaps up to 1/3 of the GNP of the world economy. So again, this is official prediction of the British government. There have been many, many different estimates that have been put out around what are the expected impacts of climate change. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates somewhere between 150 million displaced by 2050. World Health Organization goes even higher. There's a new study out of Cornell that says up to 2 billion people could be displaced, 1/5 of the world's population by 2100, based upon the new research done by James Hansen, one of the foremost climatologists, who just simply looks at projected sea level rises, looks at people who live in those coastal zones where there would be inundation by rising sea levels, and extrapolates to the figure of 2 billion people. So we already see what the impact has been of a few million on displaced out of the Middle East and Syria, on Europe and elsewhere. So we can't even imagine, at least I can't, on these types of figures. So these studies go on, and Oxfam even estimates that one person is forced from their home every 2 seconds because of extreme weather events. And Lori, keep an eye on time for me and let me know where I'm getting near my end. So a couple things I want to emphasize here is the manner in which corporate-led neoliberal globalization is exacerbating the climate related migration and climate-induced disasters. And it's doing so in three different ways. One is the global economic system is fundamentally failing to induce significant reductions in the emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, which are fueling these natural disasters. Secondly, more and more people are being displaced from their traditional lands by the expansion of foreign direct investment, increased appropriation of nature in the global south by transnational capital or domestic elites. And at the height of this a few years ago, 150,000 people were being displaced each day from their traditional lands, whether they be communal or small farms, whatever. And so the levels of social and ecological impoverishment among many of the world's populations have been going up. And then third is that we've seen a degradation of landscapes, which is reducing the capacity of nature to withstand climate-induced stresses, whether they be major rain events, if watersheds become deforested and denuded. The capacity of these landscapes to absorb climate-related shocks are also being reduced and minimized. So in many ways, one of the things I want to do is flip the thesis on its head in the sense that in many respects, climate-induced migration is a survival strategy, but it also serves the interest of some very powerful economic actors, particularly within the global south. So I don't have time, but this just reiterates these points that I just made. The other thing that's really interesting is the way in which many of the new models are now running much hotter than their previous projection. So the CO2 levels now are at 414 parts per million. Earth is about 1.4 degrees warmer. That just came out about 3 weeks ago, the new estimates. And we're going to achieve the 1.5 Celsius degree threshold by around 2034. A temperature range which is considered to be a tipping point by which we may begin to lose control over our ability to arrest and reverse climate change. So at current rates, we're going to see levels of CO2 in the atmosphere of at least 700 parts per million by the end of the century. We're on pace to reach 560 parts by the year 2070. And so in these models that are looking at these projections, and particularly the Hadley Center, which is one of the most respected climate research centers, we're looking at a world that's about 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer as a result of that if CO2 doubles. So this is why the scientific community now considers we've reached a point of where it's a planetary emergency. Unless we see dramatic reductions in CO2 levels, we will most likely in past, this is problematic, but I'll use the terminology now, we'll pass these tipping points, at which point we'll see very, very rapid increases in temperature and alterations in the global climate system. And so as we see, the 10 hottest years on record globally have occurred since 2005, and we can add 2020 to this list. It's now the hottest year on record, statistically tied for 2016, although it was slightly warmer. So you can see then, if we look at the way in which corporate-led globalization is increasingly resulting in facilitating the capitalization of nature, the conversion of nature into private property, particularly in terms of major export zones, and the way that that is resulting in the increased displacement of people from their traditional lands. And so a process of social and ecological impoverishment of the popular classes throughout the global south has led to a rise in what we call an environmentalism of the poor. And I think it's one of the more hopeful events that we see now occurring throughout the global south is the way in which poor peoples throughout the global south, in response to their increased displacement from their farms and their traditional lands and the degradation of their landscapes, are increasingly becoming integrated into a new global environmental movement and environmentalism of the poor, whether it's the women's movement, the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, the Chico movement in India and elsewhere. How am I doing on time here, Lori?
You're about up, Danny.
Okay. So let me just conclude with a couple of points here that the whole topic of climate refugees has fostered three different discourses. And one of the discourses is, neoliberal discourse is that this is can be seen as an individual opportunity for people to migrate to different parts of the world and take advantage of emerging labor markets to improve their health and well-being. So it's actually portrayed as an opportunity for those who are being displaced by climate change to seek a better life for themselves. So you've seen a neoliberal framework increasingly adopted, both in terms of discursive or rhetoric, but also in terms of policy. Then there's also a discourse which is increasingly framing climate refugees as a national security threat, and we see the implementation of policies which are quite repressive, whether it's in the United States or in Australia or other countries that treat refugees, whether they be climate or economic refugees or refugees fleeing persecution, as an increasing national security threat to the nations in which they are immigrating. And what I want to hold up is more of a justice frame, and that is the way that we should really be seeing climate refugees, and the way that we should begin addressing the climate refugee crisis is to begin to reform political economic development models in the global South, which allow people to overcome injustices and climate-induced stresses, to build new types of development models which use nature and which use resources to further improve the quality of life for people in those nations so that they are better able to withstand climate-induced stresses. So a notion of climate just development, I think, is really important, but largely absent and missing in many of the discussions around the climate refugee crisis. So I think this is one of the primary tasks for scholars, as well as for climate justice advocates, is to point the way in which sustainable development with justice, that political economic justice, is the way that you address both climate change and the crisis of climate refugees. So thanks.
Thank you, Professor Faber. I'm delighted that you bowed in the direction of possible solutions after those horrifyingly depressing statistics. And I'm happy to turn us over to Laura Kuhl, who thinks about some of the challenges of global funding and local, or the intersection of global funding and global problems and solutions. But Danny, thank you, and Laura, we'll have opportunity for conversation after this presentation. Professor Kuhl.
All right, thank you. And I think my presentation will really follow very much directly from Danny's presentation, and hopefully you're now all convinced of the urgency of addressing adaptation. I don't think you could have listened to that presentation and not be convinced of the scale and the scope of the challenge that we're facing, and also the ways in which climate change and addressing climate change intersect with all of the other social, political, economic challenges facing developing countries. And so my project is really thinking about another one of these framings that Danny ended on, that has increasingly gained traction in the discourse on climate policy, and that's the idea of transformation. And really looking at how, as transformation is put into practice in projects and policy, what are the implications of different meanings of transformation and how this plays out, particularly across scales and sort of competing power dynamics between international actors and local actors. So I want to start by explaining why I think looking at adaptation finance is so important. Danny really looked at kind of the big picture of what are all of the different kind of drivers in the whole kind of global economic system for climate migration. I'm really kind of honing in on one piece of the puzzle, which is climate finance as a part of the policy solution for this challenge of climate change. And I want to step back and say we can think about 3 different policy responses to climate change. We can mitigate, which is about reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to try and keep temperatures from rising above 2 degrees. We can adapt to the impacts of climate change. And then I think it's also really important to recognize that there is a third alternative, and that is that if we don't do enough mitigation, we don't do enough adaptation, there will be suffering. And so the goal really of adaptation policy is to try and minimize the amount of suffering that it's occurring. And I'm really motivated to look at adaptation finance because we know that the most vulnerable experience the greatest impacts of climate change, but also have the least capacity to adapt. And that this is really an ethical concern at a global level because developing countries have played the least role in causing this problem that are experiencing the greatest impacts. And so as part of kind of recognition of that injustice, there's been an agreement at the international level that developed countries have promised to provide finance to support the adaptation needs of developing countries. And so the question really is, how is that playing out? These climate funds represent a fairly small fraction of this larger global economic system that's driving vulnerability and adaptation around the world. But the funds play a really important role because they're a significant source of finance in particularly least developed countries, and therefore play an outsized role in shaping policy in these contexts. I mean, the way the photos throughout this presentation are from one of the projects that we look at in this research. It's a project in Namibia looking at adaptation in the agricultural sector. So what really motivates this research is the recognition that there's this scarcity of finance for adaptation, and that really leads countries to design projects for the fund. So we're stuck with this challenge that there's limited funding available to support adaptation, and there's a commitment on the part of these funds that it should be addressing the needs of developing countries, that it should be country driven. But we also know that the investment criteria, the priorities of the funds themselves, are also going to shape these investments. And so the question becomes, what are the implications of these investment criteria on the design of adaptation projects? And how does this then influence policy and practice on the ground? And these tensions between what the international priorities might be and what might be country-driven or even more local priorities have come up over and over again, particularly in the context of the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest source of climate finance. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of drama around a project in Ethiopia that was not approved for funding because it was deemed too much of a development project by the board. And this really kind of highlighted the tensions between what the board and kind of the fund itself deemed appropriate adaptation strategies and what countries themselves wanted. And these issues continue to arise over and over again in the context of this fund. One of the places where this has really emerged the most is around this idea of transformational change. And increasingly, we're seeing a rhetoric of transformation as a priority for adaptation policy. We see this in kind of scientific contexts in the IPCC report. We see calls on this from policymakers and global institutions. We see this also emerging as a priority in the Green Climate Fund. And when you hear a presentation like Danny's recognizing what the science looks like, what the impacts are, how could we not want transformational change? There's a recognition that this is an urgent problem, that there's that business as usual approaches to addressing the problem have been totally insufficient. And so there's a real push for more transformational approaches. In terms of the Green Climate Fund, this has been translated as an investment criteria, and you can see the definition of the criteria they use here. They call it their paradigm shift potential. And importantly, it's measured with 2 criteria, scalability and replicability. And Both of these are kind of concepts that are central to our understanding in the literature more broadly of what transformation means, but they only capture one piece of what transformation could be about. And they don't necessarily capture the ways that transformation might be about also addressing kind of the structural vulnerabilities, the inequalities in the system, the deep cultural change that might really be necessary to fundamentally shift systems to be more resilient and adapted under climate change. So we wanted to look at how is this playing out in projects, actual projects that are being funded. And here I'll just give one example of one of the projects that we looked at that really kind of epitomizes what we were finding in these narratives of these projects. This is a project in Namibia looking at agriculture. And what we found was that transformation was really conceptualized in terms of market transformations and transforming people from subsistence agriculture to participation in value chains and markets, both kind of nationally, but also internationally. And also that the ways that the transformational potential of a project were described was not in terms of transformation in the place where the project is actually happening, but in terms of how the project would be scaled up and replicated to other places outside of the scope of the project. And so this really suggests that it's international priorities, international conceptions of transformation, both in terms of kind of global markets, market economies, and in terms of impacts beyond the local location where these projects are occurring. That's what the true transformational potential of these projects is. And this is really kind of just one piece of the potential realm of ways we could think about transformation in adaptation projects. And so this is just one of the examples. We looked at 13 of these projects. We picked projects that are being implemented by domestic organizations because we thought these would be the most likely to show these more local conceptions of transformation. And even in these projects, we were seeing these very global rhetoric around transformation occurring. So I just want to kind of end here with a few reflections on what this means. And first, what our analysis really shows is that using scalability and replicability as metrics of transformation has significant consequences for the types of adaptation that are being funded through these projects. And the types of adaptation strategies that are likely to be scalable and replicable are those that are less context specific. So we saw a lot of focus on markets. We saw a lot more focus on technologies and infrastructure that can be easily scaled up and replicated, and less attention to some of those structural drivers of vulnerability that require deep local contextualization. We also saw that even though direct access, which is this funding modality that's trying to bring these proposals closer to the local level, that's and in part to try and address this tension between the international level and the local level, we saw that that's not really achieving the goal of situating these projects to address local concepts of transformation. Even within this portfolio, we're still seeing global priorities being emphasized in the proposals. And so it really leads to this question of what should the Green Climate Fund do about this? And there's, I think, two choices here. One, there can be kind of a reconceptualization of what the priorities for the fund are. But I think that's also going to be very difficult given the urgency and this push for transformation as large-scale change. And so perhaps another alternative is to recognize that the Green Climate Fund is perhaps a funding modality well suited to address certain types of transformation, those that are easily scalable and replicable and operating at a large scale, and that to address some of these other aspects of transformational change, we need to be thinking about a much more diverse set of sources of finance to be able to meet these needs. So I will end there so we have time for discussion and questions. I do just want to acknowledge that this work is a collaboration with a colleague, Jamie Shin at West Virginia University. And then also to just end by thanking the Humanities Center. This has been an absolutely amazing experience to, as kind of Danny said, to share with this amazing group of fellows and get their feedback and insight and discuss these issues all year.
Thank you, Laura. These presentations, just the urgency of the project, the immediacy of the results and what's important about them, it's just extraordinary work. So there's lots of marked applause in the group. I see Bill Hayes' hand, and Alicia both are. Bill Hayes. Alicia's applauding, but Bill Hayes actually has raised hands. It is ideal if people will. I can't see everyone because we're on 3 screens. So if you put into the chat RTS, people, I will call on you and you can pose questions and we can have discussion. Bill Hayes, you're up.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. I'm sorry I joined just a little bit late because I had a student presenting one of his papers. But this question is mostly, I think, for Laura. And in terms of, you mentioned in your work, I think, which is super important, this conflict that arises from international institutions pushing for their own agenda, and the local governments essentially playing just the adaptation approach where they try to pitch, their projects to fit within that model. But I was just also wondering, I know that you can't measure the outcomes because, these are all new projects, but to the extent that maybe you can still observe some of the anecdotal evidence around, the projects that got funded and the type of impact, for example, that they had on the ground through, some interviews, maybe, or like what did they do, maybe even if they fit like the so-called that description of replicability and so on, maybe in fact on the ground they are to some extent useful. And do you actually, can you say the opposite, that they are actually in fact completely useless and they should completely be changed and transformed? Or like in terms of, in other words, like for proposals about how maybe global climate finance might be interested, right, in terms of like this kind of feedback, what can we tell them about, look, actually you need to pay, to these issues at the local level. So thank you for reflecting on that.
Sure, you raised a lot of great questions here. And these are certainly things I spend a lot of time thinking about. I mean, I think, first of all, we know that these projects, I would say they are doing a lot of important work and on the ground, and even those components that might be less attentive to local priorities are still filling really important development and climate priorities in countries. So it's not necessarily a question of that they're useless, it's just that they might not be fulfilling the full range of what they might potentially be, kind of what's within their full mandate. The other point would be that I think one of the areas where these projects have perhaps their greatest value is in terms of their demonstration capacity, that these are really about kind of showing what's possible and showing kind of innovative approaches. And then I think we need to look at a much broader range of actors, including domestic actors, to really think about how to integrate this more fully into a domestic context.
Thank you.
Joan Fitzgerald.
Hi, thank you. Thank you both. They were really great presentations. I have a question about the migration, like what % of it is within country versus having to leave that country? Because it seems to me that would determine how much funding needs to go to helping adaptation within countries versus those people who are moving into your country and helping them situate themselves as climate refugees?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and then Laura, if you want to fill it in. The vast majority of displaced persons globally are internally displaced. And among them, most of them actually will return back to the lands from which they are displaced. So the vast majority of displacements that occur are actually temporary. It depends who's counting and how. But the majority of displacements that are occurring now globally are actually internal. And if I can just add one other point here, because it's a really great question, and it kind of ties into this larger issue around what would constitute a transformative politics. So if we think about resilience, the concept of resilience, how do we achieve true resilience and adaptability so that people don't have to move? So if political economic systems are fundamentally unjust, do we want to build up adaptability and resilience in those types of systems? Or is the stronger thesis, true adaptability and resilience can only be achieved if you address the fundamental political economic injustices that undergird that society? And so for me, a transformative in climate justice politics is not only about achieving true ecological sustainability, but also arresting those political economic injustices that I see it as a precondition, if you will. And so this is the challenge that faces the World Bank and the climate funds and US foreign policymakers, is that you have to address these fundamental injustices if you want to build true climate resiliency.
I'll just add in, I would definitely agree with everything Danny said here, and both on kind of what the dynamics of migration look like, but also around kind of some of those root causes of migration. And I think this is actually a space where the fact that both these are driven by kind of these social and ecological processes is one of the important reasons why we need to be investing a lot more in adaptation finance. Because if we can address those root causes of migration, then there won't need to be as much migration. And then also when it does become, obviously in many cases, kind of international migration is kind of migration of a last resort. And this has such huge political implications globally that there's a really good national security argument to be made, kind of a self-interested argument for investment in adaptation finance. It's much more beneficial for wealthy countries to invest in adaptation in developing countries than it is to deal with migration crises.
Natalie Reeder.
Hi, thank you so much both for these great talks. And I had a question more specifically directed at Professor Kuhl's work. But you know, when you're looking at these funding priorities that can sort of affect how these projects are being proposed, something else that I also really have seen across literature is talk about funding cycles and sort of the short-term nature of these cycles. So for these projects that really have this transformative element, you know, addressing the fundamental injustices that Professor Faber talks about, how do we go beyond the demonstration capacity? How do we address these short-term funding cycles and really think about how we can create projects that are going beyond just this like very local, small scale project?
Such a great question. And I think this is one of the sort of inherent challenges of project-based finance, and why I think there's widespread agreement that this is not the appropriate way to be really addressing these kind of large scale transformational challenges. And so I mean, one answer is that the goal of these projects often recognizes that they're not going to be able to achieve everything, and that they are really just about kind of setting the stage for ideally more domestic policy. But it also raises kind of at a more kind of micro scale this question of how do you actually measure the success of a project that has these very ambitious transformational goals that we know cannot be achieved in the time frame of a 3 to 5 year project. And so there's kind of an inherent disconnect between the goals of the project and what's measurable within it.
Do you want to add anything, Danny?
Well, I would just say that there are many different models at how you build true resilience to climate change at the local level. And so, for example, in Afghanistan, there was a project, Samsortia Afghanistan, where communities have come together to create nurseries to grow fruit trees, and that provide fuel wood, but they also provide food and shade, and they help restore watersheds in rural Afghanistan, but they really are women-centric. They are run by women. They are a source of income for women. So it's also about community empowerment. And then out of that grows programs for building wells, and then midwives, and bringing local medical facilities. So you have a lot of programs happening throughout the Global South that are starting by communities. They're starting from the bottom up. And I think one of the roles that international financial institutions can play is to not necessarily come in with a top-down model, but look at different types of programs that are actually working in the Global South and to fund those, and then to help those models become utilized in other parts of the Global South. And so I think that's something that needs to happen with international institutions, really looking at these models that have this organic origins, if you will. They're starting with grassroots, they're bottom up, they're people-centric, and because many of them are really quite innovative and are proving to be quite effective.
So I hope that there are more questions from this wonderful audience, but while we're waiting for a hand to be raised or an RTS, you know, I've heard both of you speak about this, and we've talked about these your own projects in an interdisciplinary context in the group. But listening today, I wanted to ask about the intersection of the best science and the best public policy, because you know, we talk a lot about here funding and social justice and public policy and inequities, but you know, but climate change is about what we're doing to the environment, and whether or not science can actually knows what it needs to know to make enough change to, I mean, it's one thing to create the policies, but do we have the science to make the changes we need to have a planet we can live on? In what time frame? And what are the places like our Humanities Center where the scientists are talking to the policymakers, so that the policymakers are also making the best choices, not only in terms of policy and helping people locally, but doing what can be done in the fastest way for climate change, to address climate change.
Laura, do you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Doesn't matter. I mean, I'm happy to take a stab first and pass it on to you. So, I mean, I think this is absolutely one of the things I love about this topic, and it's something we kind of grapple with in my class pretty much every day, is this intersection of the need for technical knowledge, a deep understanding of the science, and an understanding of politics, of culture, of sort of people, in order to address these challenges. And I would say one thing that we talk a lot about is using science to also make sure that what has been done in the past that might have been a great coping strategy, a really innovative grassroots bottom-up solution to address climate stresses, might not be necessarily appropriate under future climate conditions. And there is a really important role for technical expertise and understanding to be able to inform those local solutions. And then also that when we're comparing different options, we do have to actually make sure that they will work technically, and that they'll actually be addressing the climate challenges. But I think that often those kind of technical expertise and scientific knowledge gets really elevated and prioritized much more than the science sort of understanding of cultural context and knowledge. And so there's a real need to recognize that these are fundamentally questions often of social vulnerability.
Yeah, if I can apply a justice lens in answering your question, Lori, which is a really fundamental question. I always say that the primary goal of the environmental justice movement is not to ensure that all people are polluted equally. And similarly, the same goal of the climate justice movement is not to ensure that all people are impacted by climate change equally. So rather than, in order to move beyond a politics, which is not in my backyard, to not in anyone's backyard, we have to address the fundamental political economic causes of environmental injustices or the climate crisis. And that's the necessity of transformative climate politics, which goes to the root causes. So in terms of the science, that's moving away from an economic system that's dependent upon fuels from hell, coal, gas, oil, to one that's dependent upon fuels from heaven, particularly solar and wind. But I would say that how you do that is really important. And Joan's done a lot of work on this, in terms of different models that have been utilized in cities all over the world. But what would constitute an emancipatory climate justice politics? So we can envision large solar collectors that can exist in the desert or take up a lot of pristine farmland that we continue to pay a high cost of energy to receive from a private utility. Or we can envision a type of technology that directly goes on our own homes and our own facilities. And with net metering, the meter runs backwards so that we become not just a consumer, but a producer of our own energy. And perhaps we get a check from the utility at the end of the month rather than vice versa. And so creating a vision, whether it's around a Green New Deal politics or a transformative politics that allows us to see how tackling this climate crisis doesn't lead us to retreat into our home in the magnitude of the severity of this crisis, but how can we be inspired by a vision of how addressing climate change can actually result in the creation of a better society, that we can have a higher quality of life if we take the right types of actions to arrest climate change. So I really feel like a justice lens is really important for doing that. But we were doing this around chemicals policy, and in Europe with REACH, they've done this. It's not just enough to try and regulate the public's exposure to different types of chemicals. In Europe, the burden is placed upon industry to prove that a chemical is safe before it can be introduced into the marketplace. In the United States, the burden is placed upon the public to prove that a chemical is dangerous after it's been introduced into the marketplace. So we're essentially all guinea pigs, and it's only after you have a major human health disaster that we get some type of policy outcome. So this is a new type of policy making in Europe that is much more precautionary. It's much more preventative in nature. And so it brings together the intersectionality of different issues, whether it's affordable housing, like I just mentioned, the climate crisis, but also greater intersectionality between science, natural sciences, and public policy and the social sciences, so that we can see how all these different issues intersect and arrive at more holistic solutions. And I think some of the best work around this, around what would constitute a much more transformative approach in the area of public policy or climate policy, environmental justice, is actually being done here at Northeastern by many of the faculty, some of which are on this call right now. And I think it's really, really exciting. It's a whole new paradigm, but we have to go in this direction, because one of the hallmarks of traditional environmental policy is that very often you address one problem in such a way that it unintentionally displaces the problem into another segment of society. And so we need these more holistic policy approaches, which are predicated on some of the best science available, that really begin to go to the root causes of the crisis.
I'm persuaded, Danny. But it's formidable. There are about 4 minutes left. If there is a quick question that somebody would like to pose. Scanning the screens here, because I have I always have the same self-interested question that is, as the director of the Humanities Center and participant in this, in the faculty fellows. That is, if you could share anything about the advantages that you experience of having this kind of conversation and work about your work process, how your work process is impacted by being in conversation with people who are in adjacent fields and, participating in the conversations we have for the at the fellows meetings.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I just have to say this has been the most amazing writing group to participate in. And one of the things that has just been so incredible is how interdisciplinary it is. And it's really kind of helped me to think about what are some of the ideas that are obvious? What are the things that resonate across a wide range of fields that are really kind of those pieces of my work that cut across just my own interests and are things that people much more widely care about. But then also to think about where do I need to further explain and sort of unpack my own assumptions, and really being able to see that much more clearly by the types of questions that people in other fields have of the work that I'm doing. I mean, that's been one piece. The other thing that's just been really amazing is to be in conversation with a number of my more senior colleagues throughout the university, and kind of being able to envision what some of these research projects might look like 10, 15 years down the line. And it's really kind of been a year of helping me to think much more expansively about what my entire research agenda might be looking forward. So certainly at a personal level, I would say it's been a transformational experience.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to give you the last word, Danny, because I see that there's also, and I saw that you were reading the question in the chat, so you might want to speak to that. And by way of my last word, I would just like to thank everybody for participating today. We'll hear Danny's last comments and just remind you that on April 5th, 12 o'clock, to please come if you can to hear Professors Gretchen Hefner and Philip Tai, who will present their work related to the pandemic teaching initiative on disease diplomacy and science in the Cold War, lessons for future pandemics, an ominous title. But Danny, I'm going to give you the last word.
All right, thanks so much. So I really think now in terms of intersectionality, that is, how do race, class, gender, neocolonial status, how do they intersect in these larger structures of power, so that if we want to communicate policy solutions or the severity of the climate crisis, how can we develop a discourse with resonates with different peoples from walks of with people from different walks of life, so that even though they're experiencing the impacts of climate change differentially, they can see how it's connected to other people and how we can develop a common agenda. And that also speaks to the intersectionality of issues and how can we develop a broad-based agenda that can simultaneously address different issues in a more holistic framework. And so the interdisciplinary perspective that comes through the Humanities Centers is really conducive to that, where it's often difficult for us to step out of our boxes in our own academic disciplines to think in more interdisciplinary terms. And I always thought of myself as thinking very interdisciplinary, but when you're in a truly interdisciplinary group evaluating your work, it takes it to a whole nother level. So that's been incredibly fruitful. And then the other part of this is also that how do you communicate the work that all of us are doing in an academic setting into a more popular discourse so that it can resonate with the larger society? I think this is one of the most important challenges that we face as scholars, is how do we bring our work out from behind the academic paywall so that it can have a larger impact in public policy circles or among activists and so forth. And the last point I would say in responding to the chat, I'm very heartened right now because I see this unprecedented mobilization among young people in the United States and all over the world. I think there's a clear recognition that we are facing a planetary crisis, which is climate change. And perhaps like no other generation before, there's a yearning to become mobilized and to begin to transform our society in such a way that we can arrest this crisis. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us then as scholars to really begin thinking seriously about how we can make our work accessible to these larger movements, and make our work relevant to the struggles that are now taking place to build a more just and sustainable world. And I think we're doing that really well at Northeastern. And that's one of the reasons we're attracting such phenomenal students and have such tremendous scholars coming in, because I think there's a recognition. Northeastern's always been a place where this is a place you come to do progressive policy and to do work which can help make society better. So I just think we got to continue that work and do it even better.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Danny. I agree. I think that Northeastern is taking the lead, and my hope is that as the Humanities Center develops public humanities, we already have a very strong public history program. We'll have more and more initiatives that take the fruits of academic investigations to the public. So I appreciate everyone being here today. Thank you for staying, and I hope to see you at the next Faculty Works in Progress. And special thanks to Laura and Danny and to all of our fellows.